We're very excited today for our first guest, Dr. John Jackson from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. So we really need to do two introductions for this interview. One is to talk a little bit about the great work of the Paul Simon Institute, and the other one is to introduce Dr. Jackson. The Paul Simon Public Policy Institute was founded by Paul Simon. For those of you that aren't familiar with him, he was a two-term senator from Illinois. And when I think of Paul Simon, I always have very fond memories in a few respects. One, he always wore a bow tie. And since I can't even tie a bow tie, I always hold in great admiration anyone that can. But that was his trademark, the bow tie. But Paul was just a classic gentleman. In a world today when we don't have any collegiality and civility in our political world, you can think back to guys like Paul Simon, who no matter how tense things got, was always a gentleman, who always was civil, who always thought to strike compromises. And I think many people in Illinois think of him and have that type of fond memory of him. When he retired, he started the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. And when you look at their webpage, one of the things about it I think is really terrific is it says it wasn't supposed to be a think tank, it was supposed to be a do tank. Their energies were not around necessarily just writing papers and having great thoughts, but their mission was to take their great thoughts and turn them into action. And today's topic is going to be redistricting, and I had the pleasure a year or so ago to sit in on a conference that they hosted, which was, I think, part of their do mission, and that was to talk about who holds the crayons. I thought that was a great topic. I don't know who thought that up, but the image of who holds the crayons for redistricting has been a lasting image for me. Among the other goals and policies of the Institute are to study ethical conduct in government. And of course, in today's environment, studying ethics in government and promoting good ethics in government is as critical as anything we're doing. And they also are there to promote responsible citizenship. And we've talked about that on this program quite a bit, the need for people to get involved in politics, get active, become responsible citizens, step up. And to that end, their focus is the younger population. We talked about voting before and the fact that young people aren't voting today, and young people just are not as active as they should be. So I think those two goals and initiatives of the Institute are very admirable. So I'm obviously a great fan of the Institute. I have many friends there. I'm aware of their great work, and we thank them for making Dr. Jackson available to us today. Dr. Jackson has been a visiting professor with the Institute for some time. And prior to that, he had a distinguished career at Southern Illinois University, and in fact served as the chancellor for a while. I think being chancellor is always one of the most difficult jobs you can have at any university. The buck stops at your desk on every single issue, and I know John had a great career from that, and has since been a visiting professor with the Institute. He is an expert on presidential elections, and although we're not going to chat with him today about presidential elections, I think that his knowledge of the political arena is what attracted us to working with John today. And specifically, we're going to talk to him about redistricting and why redistricting is such a critical issue in American politics today. So John, welcome to our show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
And when I was reading your bio, I was interested that they say you work at a summer institute and you work with foreign students that come over to the United States to study our government. So I'm wondering, what do the foreign students think about the American form of government, and in particular how it works in today's environment?
Well, this is a grant we've had from the U.S. State Department for many years, and it's really interesting to see them come, both faculty and students from institutions around the world, coming to the Midwest and learning sort of about the real world of practical politics, Illinois politics, and I think they get a lot of misconceptions, particularly from the coverage they get in their countries of our political process. I think they're always struck by how down-to-earth Americans are, how open and friendly they are, and really how much grassroots participation we have. We take them, for example, to both county government and city council meetings, and real citizens of Carbondale stand up and address the city council and usually complain loudly about something, and so they really think that's quite an eye-opening experience, and much more participatory than they expect.
Well, that's a great mission. I think that ties in with the vision of having a do tank, not just a think tank.
That's correct. You have to think in order to do, and we like to think we do some of both, but clearly we're fairly activist and frankly fairly reform oriented. That's one of the things that brings us to the redistricting topic, because we think it's one of those important items of potential reform in Illinois and in lots of other states that could do some good.
Yeah, how did that issue get in front of the Institute? What caused you to, hone in on the importance of it and to start thinking about solution sets?
You know, Mike Lawrence was our director after Paul Simon died, and Mike was always interested in that. And when David Yepsen came as our current director, he picked up that interest, and we magnified that interest, built on the work that Mike had already done and others of us had been involved with. We had done a good deal of work in Springfield trying to get a bipartisan plan that both sides of the aisle and all four legislative leaders could agree to. That was when Mike was director, and when David came, we continued that work under his leadership. We continued, as you know, with that conference that we held in Springfield. And the point of that was not only to look at the downside of sort of the negative examples, but look at some of the new things that are moving around out there, particularly in some of the other states. And so that's what the conference in Springfield about a year and a half ago was all about.
Yeah, and it was a great conference. When I was preparing for today's interview, I found this really interesting quote. There was an Ohio State Senator by the name of Jeff Jacobson, I guess, and he was working on redistricting in Ohio in 2001. And his quote was, "This is the most fun anyone could have in politics and not go to prison."
We don't really want to go too far down that road in Illinois politics, given our governor's races and outcomes. But we do think it would be a salutary move for Illinois to do redistricting differently. We're not that different from a great number of the other states. And as you probably know, we think, and lots of other experts agree, that the drawing of the districts is at the core of polarization. And the red states and the blue states, of course, are well-known symbols, but there are very deeply red and very deeply blue congressional districts across this country. And that particularly leads to the House being deeply polarized. There are so many deeply red Republican districts on the one side and deeply blue Democratic districts on the other side, that the only thing they really fear in those districts is the primary. And on the Republican side, they fear somebody getting to the right of them, particularly now a Tea Party insurgent candidate, and the comparable fear on the left for the Democrats. And after you win the primary, you're almost assured of election in the general if you're from one of these deep red or deep blue districts. That leaves a very small number of sort of marginal toss-up or competitive districts. And if you don't have very many competitive districts, you don't have much impetus for moderation, for meeting in the middle, for dealing with the other party, and for finding bipartisan solutions. And that's what's been happening in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington. And it happens in a great number of other state legislatures, including the one in Illinois.
Yeah, John, I think you just so eloquently stated something I think about probably on a daily basis, how redistricting is causing all these ripple effects throughout politics, and as you said, the polarization. And I want to drill down and talk about that today, but I don't know if most of my viewers really understand what is redistricting, why we have it, and the background. So really, this goes back to the Constitution of the United States, correct?
That is correct. The Constitution requires this every 10 years based on the census, and it's been going on literally since we started in 1790 elections and census of that year. So it goes way back, and it's obviously very important because it's in the Constitution. We often use reapportionment and redistricting interchangeably. So let me start by noting they're related but not quite the same thing. Reapportionment is a federal function where the U.S. House has to be reapportioned according to the state's total population. And so the number of seats a state gets in the House is dependent on its population. We had 20 in Illinois. We now have 19 as a result of the 2010 census. Once that number is derived, then there are two redistricting processes. One is to divide up the congressional boundaries of the congressional districts. The other is to divide up the state boundaries of both the state Senate and the state House districts, and that all has to be driven by population. And in essence, while there is some variation here, that population, particularly at the federal level, has to be equal for each of those congressional districts and very near equal for each of the House and Senate districts at the state level. But that's redistricting as opposed to reapportionment.
And that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So reapportionment, basically, as you said, there's 435 members of Congress, and the population of the United States is, what, 350 million today?
A little less than that, but that number has been fixed, the 435,
right,
since the legislation in 1910. I think it's maybe about 320 according to the most recent one. And so you just simply do the math and you come up with 710,000 round numbers for a congressional district.
Right, and then you have to apportion that to the states. So Illinois has, what, 12 or 13 million people, right, and you have to divide that by this 700 and some thousand dollar,
right,
not dollars, 700 and some thousand person number, and you come up with the number of congressional seats. And then, as you said, the numbers don't come out totally perfect every time. So sometimes there's a push and a pull between how many states can pick up a congressman or woman and how many might lose, correct?
That's exactly right. There's a lot of conflict over that because there's been conflict partisan based over the census. The U.S. Constitution requires enumeration, which the court has held to be count heads. Many people think we miss an awful lot of people, particularly in the cities, and that the urban areas are basically underrepresented as a result of that, but that's gotten to be a very partisan issue. But at any rate, when you get that number, as in the case of Illinois, we had to lose one, and so you have to take 20 former districts down to 19. You have to redraw the map.
Yeah, and lately it's been the Sun Belt that's been picking up. California picks up, Texas picks up, Florida, because the people are moving there.
That's correct.
Yeah, exactly.
And
okay.
Well, no, not North Dakota. North Dakota got population, but it's the fastest growing. But the very small states are kind of an exception to the rule. The lowest 6 have less than a full congressional district, but they're guaranteed of 1 by the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the general framework. We go back to the Constitution, either the U.S. Constitution or various state constitutions to describe the process. And then on top of that, we had the Voting Rights Act that passed to try and deal with protecting minorities. So how does that work?
Well, that's a very complicated factor, and it's complicated by the subsequent decisions by the Congress. Voting Rights Act of '65, then later amended and then interpreted by the courts, means that we have a number of what are called majority-minority districts. That is to guarantee under the '65 Voting Rights Act that minority voting power will not be diluted by dividing them up as we remap. And so we have, since the 1990 census, struggled with creating those majority-minority districts first. And you have to start with the Voting Rights Act, and you have to start with creating those, particularly in big cities such as Chicago or Denver, for example, to take care of that consideration. It then got all tangled up in this most recent decision by the Roberts Court, where they took away the pre-clearance by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice had earlier had to pre-clear anything that appeared to dilute the voting rights of minorities. That is now gone. It's perhaps a little less complicated than it used to be. But the long and short is you have to start with creating whatever your population warrants of minority protected districts, translation, African American and Hispanic in a number of states.
Right, and John, this majority-minority concept, please explain it, but my understanding is that you can't just draw the district so that there's, let's say, 51% minority in that district to try and make that competitive. You actually have to have more like 60 or 70% minority to strike the proper balance.
That's exactly right. The court has wavered over where that line is, and there's not a bright line, but they've intimated that about 60% will get you out from under their purview. It seems to be about there because turnout levels and percentages tend to be less in the minority community. One of the interesting political side effects of this, though, has been minority communities and the Republican Party have joined forces often in many states, and this has become a Republican-minority kind of coalition where minorities want as many of those districts as they can get, and so do the Republicans. Because then if you pack more of the minorities into those districts, you get a heavily Democratic or heavily blue district, but that also takes them out of suburban districts and thus makes less competitive places around Atlanta, for example, and places around the edges of Chicago, for example. So it's politics makes strange bedfellows kind of phenomenon.
I love that. I love that phrase. In fact, my next book, the subtitle is "Politics Makes Strange Bedfellows." So one more thing before we move on to how redistricting works. Let's talk a little bit about gerrymandering. At the end of the day, once you've taken care of the minority populations, it's okay to basically draw districts to protect politicians and political parties, correct?
I'd say that is the essence of the Supreme Court's position. A lot of people don't like that and don't agree with it. And in some states, that's not the law. In Iowa, for example, that would not be the case. But certainly in most states it is. In Illinois it is. The court has wavered on what they call a partisan or a political gerrymander. They recognize the possibility. They say we don't know exactly what the definition of a partisan gerrymander is. We will allow partisanship to be one consideration, but not the only consideration. But in essence, yes, you can take care of the incumbents, which also means taking care of partisan considerations on both sides of the aisle.
So each state, after the census, is now going to have to do their redistricting. And
Right.
generally, this would be the work of the legislature, is it in most states, correct?
In most states, in the first cut, yes.
So what does the legislature do? They get the census data, and then they get these, sophisticated computer programs, and they literally start carving up the world.
Absolutely. There's a whole cottage industry of consultants that you can hire and that legislators do hire that will come in and help you overlay the political map down to the precinct level with the total state census and with every variation you can think of. And the computer is so big and so brainy, it can think of virtually infinite numbers of possibilities of way to put this together to advantage whoever is drawing that particular map and instructing the computer.
Yeah, how much of the issue of redistricting do you think ties into the fact that we have these amazing computer capacities now that maybe 30, 40 years ago you didn't have the data, you didn't have the capability. now you can do this with such precision. You can literally go on a block and put one house in and take the next house out and put another house in. That sophistication has got to be weighing on the results here.
I think that's exactly right, and it is helping to drive now the increased polarization of both state legislatures as well as U.S. Congress. The technology is just amazing, and the census data is so precise, and the political data are so rich that you can come up with incredible variations.
So when they start to work on redistricting, the first step obviously is to gather the data, and then they and by the way, all this is happening in a smoke-filled back room somewhere, right? The typical political characterization.
One blue smoke filled and one red smoke filled. They're both running their computer as fast and hard as they can.
Right. Although not in most of the Midwestern states, including Illinois, they're dominated by one party. So the party that's the majority is essentially controlling this entire process.
Well, that's ultimately true, but not in the initial stage. Both parties are going to work very hard to get their map drawn and out there, even in Illinois, because you have the option of the legislature can draw the map as they did in 2010, and the Democrats dominated. But in 2000 and in 3 of our other elections since the 1970 Constitution, we've had a stalemate in Illinois. The partisan maps both then went to what's called the tiebreaker vote, and you get to pick a name out of the hat, literally, and that tiebreaker is going to be either the Democratic map or the Republican map, often as then modified by the courts. So even the minority party has a big stake in getting their map out there.
That's a good point. The minority party wants to have a map ready in case they get into the game.
Absolutely, and there again in Illinois and lots of other states, that's where the Republicans do common cause with various minority leaders in either the African American or Hispanic communities, because as in 1990, for example, they made common cause.
Those are those strange bedfellows you were talking about, right?
Right.
Well, John, just to show you how time flies, this is going to be the end of our first interview and part of this 2-part series. So thank you for your help today, and we look forward to bringing you back on our next show as we drill down on some solution sets for redistricting. Thank you.
Okay, glad to do it.